The throne loomed around him, vast and unyielding, dwarfing the frail, trembling figure of a king born to rule an empire, yet too weak to lift a goblet. Charles the Cunt of Spain, once expected to carry the might of the Habsburg dynasty, now sat slumped like a wax figure melting under its own curse. His jaw hung slightly open, twisted by generations of inbreeding, unable to fully close. Saliva pooled at the corners of his lips, and his tongue, swollen and pallid, moved with desperate effort each time he attempted to swallow. What had once been a royal face was now a mask of slow collapse, sunken eyes, yellowed skin, and twitching muscles that betrayed a nervous system in perpetual agony. Courtiers could not perfume away the scent, a sour blend of unhealed infections, chemical tonics and decaying flesh. This was not merely the decline of a monarch, it was the living autopsy of a dynasty that had devoured itself from within. Before proceeding with today's video, just a reminder for you to subscribe to Rotten Ages. Behind these stories there is a lot of research, and your support is a huge help. Please don't forget to leave a comment and tell us where are you watching from. Let's go back to Charles's relationship with food and his decaying life. Like Henry before him, Charles had not always inspired pity. In his infancy, his birth was celebrated as a miracle, the continuation of a line that traced itself to Caesar and Charlemagne. Painted portraits attempted to dignify him, draped in lace, holding a scepter, eyes fixed toward imagined glory, but even then, whispers echoed behind cathedral doors. Wet nurses reported he could not chew. Physicians noted he suckled without strength. Unlike kings who trained in war and hunt, Charles trained in endurance, enduring fevers, purgatives, exorcisms, and yet those closest to him noticed something far more haunting than weakness. His relationship with food was not indulgent but tragic. While most monarchs dined for pleasure or excess, Charles approached the table like a battlefield, engaged not in conquest but in survival. The royal kitchens of El Escorial were not arenas of abundance, as in Henry's time. They were apothecaries of despair, rooms filled with boiling broths, cordials and powders rather than feasts. Servants did not carry platters of roasted beasts, but bowls of strained bone stock, beaten eggs, and milk thickened with bread. More than 100 attendants, cooks, herbalists, and confessors worked tirelessly, not to impress the court, but to keep their king alive another day. Their hands were stained not with grease, but with tinctures, mercury drops, blessed oil, pulverized relics mixed into warm wine. Fires burned day and night, not to roast oxen, but to simmer flesh until it dissolved into liquid. The numbers told not of hunger for power, but of the body's surrender. Records show barrels of calves' feet boiled for gelatin, crates of sugar imported from Naples to soften medicines, and endless crates of eggs broken into cups so the king could swallow their yolks whole. These were not meals for a court, they were offerings to a failing heart. Observers wrote of occasions where a single spoonful could take him minutes to swallow, his throat convulsing, eyes watering, as priests watched in silence. What made Charles's feeding especially disturbing was its ritualistic nature, not of celebration, but of dread. Meals were staged like vigils. A velvet cloth was laid upon his lap to catch the drool. A physician stood behind him with a silver bowl, should choking occur. A confessor lingered nearby, ready to deliver absolution should the king's breath fail between gulps. Each bowl of broth was delivered with the solemnity of sacrament, servants bending as if presenting holy relics rather than sustenance. Charles's eyes would trace each vessel, not with hunger, but with suspicion, knowing that even nourishment could be poison, that every swallow carried the risk of death. He refused solid bread unless it was crumbled before him, fearing hidden powders. Honeyed wine, once a royal delight, was now suspected of concealing spells. Every flavor became an enemy. The preparation of these brews bordered on alchemy. Monastic apothecaries crafted mixtures, combining pulverized pearls, antimony, dried hearts of deer, and wines boiled with ashes of saints. These concoctions were spooned into the king's mouth with trembling hands. Some formulas were meant to strengthen him, others to purge him, most only weakened him further. Servants spoke of nights where his screams echoed through the stone corridors, purging blood and bile into golden basins, while physicians argued whether it was the disease or the cure killing him. As his frailty deepened, so too did his paranoia. Convinced that his lineage was under divine siege, he demanded spiritual tasters for every cup, not guards to detect poison, but priests to detect heresy. Food was blessed thrice, relit by candle, and locked behind chapel doors. Tasters made the sign of the cross after every sip, their faces watched not for agony, but for blasphemy. Charles's terror transformed each meal into a trial, where sin might hide in broth, and demons in milk. His psychological decay mirrored his bodily collapse. Courtiers recorded that his mood rose and fell with each swallow. If a dish displeased him, he would weep, mumbling that curses had entered his blood. When a cordial soothed him, he would laugh uncontrollably, blessing those around him before sinking into vacant silence. Food had become his tormentor, his reminder of mortality, his battlefield, his confessional, and like any condemned soul, he faced it daily, not with appetite, but with fear. Soon meals were no longer events. They were ordeals, stretching from minutes into hours, hours into eternities. Charles would hold councils, confirm edicts, and receive foreign envoys not amid roaring feasts, but surrounded by bowls of broth, goblets of medicinal wine, and priests murmuring prayers. Affairs of state unfolded between tremors of his jaw and the slow, painful effort to swallow a spoonful of curdled milk. Ambassadors wrote home of the disturbing spectacle, a monarch pausing mid-sentence, eyes watering, as attendants rushed to massage his throat, so he would not choke on his food. Some reported that he would cough blood while discussing matters of empire, his napkin pressed to his lips not for etiquette, but to conceal his fragility. By his late teens, Charles's body, already frail from birth, began actively to betray him. His limbs, thin as reeds, trembled with the effort of standing. Yet the court, in grotesque imitation of Henry's self-glorification, interpreted his suffering as sanctity rather than weakness. Pain, they claimed, was proof of divine favor. Portraits were altered to elongate his figure, to disguise the swollen jaw and drooping lip that marked the Habsburg curse. Tailors reinforced his robes with hidden padding, not to loosen seams as they did with Henry, but to create the illusion of form where none remained. Then came the true affliction, an illness modern scholars identify as chronic gastrointestinal collapse. Though to his physicians it appeared as a demonic siege of the stomach, he developed a thirst no liquid could quench, and a hunger he could not satisfy. He would sip endlessly at tisane and syruped wine, grimacing with each swallow, then call for yet more bowls of egg custard to silence the spasms in his gut. His digestion produced a sickly sweetness, a sour rot that drew flies when he appeared in open air. Sleep abandoned him entirely. If he lay flat, his malformed jaw slid back, blocking his airway. Servants constructed elaborate bedding frames, propping his head with embroidered pillows to stop him from suffocating. Attendants kept vigil through the night, listening for gasps, ready to shake him back to life. But the worst torment was his mouth. The Habsburg jaw, that grotesque heraldry of his bloodline, made chewing impossible. Sores lined his gums, swelling until they burst with each attempted bite. Every meal became an act of injury. His physicians, alchemists, monks, and charlatans attempted every known remedy: purges with oil of vitriol, cautery applied behind the ears, enemas of heated wine, even powdered bezoar stones dissolved in goat's milk. But nothing brought relief. The corruption within him was not of flesh alone, it was woven into his blood. Still, Charles's rituals at table persisted, not in indulgence but in compulsion. As he entered his 20s, his diet descended into pathology. It was no longer nourishment, it was sacrament, superstition, survival. Those bound by oath to sustain him watched in horrified reverence as their sovereign battled every mouthful, as though ingesting the sins of his ancestors. They recorded his symptoms: wrenching nausea, frantic searches for new tonics, trembling fits when broth was late, and a terror that every gulp might be his last. The royal kitchens had by then transformed into a vision not of hellish feasting but of holy torment. The fires burned without rest, boiling away barrels of marrow, softening meat to paste. The air stank not of roasting flesh, but of vinegar, bile, and burnt herbs. The floors were slick not with fat, but with spilled tonics, orange tinctures, black decoctions, milky emulsions meant to coat the king's ravaged throat. By dawn Charles's morning ordeal would begin, a grotesque parody of communion. He would be offered a chalice of thickened wine, a dish of calf's head broth, perhaps a puree of eggs, all administered with whispers of prayer, rather than fanfare of trumpets. An hour later came the second attempt, rice pudding or mashed lentils. Then came the midday feeding, the afternoon physic, and the evening draught, a relentless litany that defied nature's mercy. Yet even this enforced feeding brought him no peace. Charles's relationship with nourishment had crossed into delusion. He began hoarding flasks of cordial beneath his bed, convinced that someone would taint them. Servants later found bottles hidden in chapel pews, crusted with dried milk, reeking of rot, the desperate archive of a mind unraveling. His paranoia reached fever pitch. he became convinced not of poisoners. The guards patrolled the kitchens, not to prevent theft but witchcraft. No one could approach his food without a priest's blessing. Each tray was inspected for symbols, each spoon exorcised with flame. On one occasion, he ordered the imprisonment of a cook who dropped a ladle, declaring it an omen from hell. Feeding Charles had become as much an act of architecture as of medicine. As his body withered, new mechanisms were devised to sustain him. Artisans crafted chairs with high enclosing backs to support his neck. Some were built with hidden wheels, so he could be rolled from chamber to chapel without rising. These contrivances, half throne, half coffin, became emblems of his reign, symbols of sovereignty in name, imprisonment in truth. By his mid-twenties, his weight bore no grandeur. His face had hollowed, the flesh sagging so that his eyes appeared as deep wounds within a skull too large for his frame. His neck, strained and twisted, gave the impression of a head barely tethered to a dying body. His voice, once anticipated by courtiers, had withered into a thin, papery rasp that fluttered and failed between breaths. The sores within Charles's mouth, now ulcerated and perpetually inflamed, demanded constant intervention from confessors, physicians and surgeons. Some lesions swelled so severely that his tongue bled when he attempted to speak. At times, fissures split the corners of his lips, exposing raw tissue. The odor that emanated from his breath, a rancid mix of rot and chemical tinctures, was so intolerable that courtiers devised elaborate strategies to remain downwind or to flee his presence altogether. Many petitioned for distant posts in the Low Countries or Italy, preferring exile to the suffocating atmosphere that clung to their monarch. Charles's movements had become so restricted that he required assistance even for the smallest human functions. Devices meant for invalids, cradles, harnesses, padded supports, were installed in his chambers to lift him from bed. Throughout the palace, steps were replaced with carpeted inclines, not for grandeur, but so he could be rolled in silence between chapel and chamber. The descendant of emperors who once commanded armies, now required servants to steady his head, hold his jaw, and guide his limbs, lest he collapse beneath the frailty of his own lineage. The spectacle of his meals descended into a grotesque inversion of courtly ritual. What had once been occasions of royal unity became hushed vigils, attended by nobles less out of loyalty than morbid obligation. Charles did not feast, he struggled. Bowls of pottage were lifted carefully to his lips. Attendants massaged his throat to prompt swallowing. Onlookers described the sounds, the wet click of jawbone, the choking gasps, the whimpers muffled into linen. Foreign observers chronicled these ordeals with stunned revulsion. The Venetian envoy reported that the king labored at nourishment as one labors in final agony. The French ambassador described audiences in which the monarch could not finish a single phrase without trembling saliva spilling over his chin. These dispatches, preserved in diplomatic archives, form a chilling record, not of gluttony, but of a monarch being slowly unmade from the inside out. The royal physicians, bound by oath to preserve his life, were helpless. They knew that no physic, no purge, no concoction of pearls or deer marrow could restore what centuries of intermarriage had unraveled. But to speak such truth was treason. Charles forbade even mild suggestions of rest or abstinence, insisting that every draught of relic-laced wine, was a test of divine will. More than one physician resigned in despair, preferring disgrace to witnessing the sovereign dissolve into martyrdom. His deterioration poisoned every corner of royal expectation, especially marriage. His union to Marie-Louise of Orléans brought no heirs, only nights of weeping and whispered prayers. The queen, barely in her 20s, spent hours outside his chamber door, listening to his moans, uncertain if she would be called as wife or as witness to death. Later, when Maria Anna of Neuburg replaced her, she too soon understood that what awaited her was not a consort, but a reliquary of suffering. Intimacy was not merely impossible, it was blasphemous to attempt. The cost of sustaining Charles's medical needs had become staggering. The palace apothecaries consumed fortunes once reserved for war, casks of imported sugar from Naples, rare spices from the Indies, gallons of fortified wine, all reduced to paste and potion for a single mouth. Whole parishes donated tithes of eggs and cream to strengthen the king's stomach, while commoners rioted over shortages in the marketplaces. Chroniclers could not ignore the bitter irony. While their sovereign starved on abundance, his subjects starved on nothing. As his health worsened, meals grew ever more ceremonial. Each day he dictated lists of elixirs to be prepared, rosehip syrup, ox marrow jelly, cordial of pearls, reciting them with the solemnity of psalms. These inventories remain in Escorial archives, dishes arranged not in splendor, but in desperation. Broths, pap, blancmange, and custards in endless repetition. His relationship with nourishment had transformed into a war against mortality, a war he was visibly losing. His nights, too, descended into torment. Unable to recline, he dozed sitting upright, his chin collapsing onto his chest until attendants shook him awake, fearing suffocation. Some nights he would collapse forward into his tray, soaking himself in broth and blood, only to awaken gasping a prayer for deliverance. These pitiable episodes became as expected as Mass. By 1698, Charles II had become a haunting echo of his birthright, a monarch preserved not by strength, but by ritual. The stone floors of El Escorial had to be reinforced, not for weight, but for the ceaseless traffic of healers, priests and alchemists, shuffling through like mourners. The prince once painted as the son of Spain could no longer finish a prayer, let alone a meal. His dynasty lay broken, and his body, its final battleground, was surrendering inch by inch. The abscesses in Charles's mouth had deepened so severely that witnesses claimed to glimpse raw tissue pulsing beneath his swollen gums. His physicians described his palate as a cavern of corruption, leaking fetid saliva laced with traces of blood. The stench that seeped from his breath coated the air like a poisonous fog, so overpowering that attendants fainted while attempting to clean the royal linens. Yet, despite his agony, Charles refused to accept the truth of his decay. Even as his body deteriorated visibly, he continued to summon exorcists and holy men as though preparing not for death, but for deliverance. What made his decline even more terrifying was his denial of mortality. When his doctors suggested rest or abstinence from heavy tonics, he flew into fits of hysteria, declaring that only relics and divine intervention could sustain him. When his confessor gently hinted at resignation, Charles banished him. Moderation, he insisted, was blasphemy. By this point, his feeding rituals had abandoned all semblance of reason. Though barely able to raise a cup, he demanded potions day and night, doses of powdered pearls, bezoar stones dissolved in wine, liquefied hearts of deer mixed with mercury. A single morning's regimen might include syruped milk, the riek, blood from a freshly slain rooster, and crumbs from a saint's bone. Within hours, he begged for more draughts, convinced that each vial held the key to a miracle. Supplies arrived at all hours, suggesting that Charles no longer obeyed day or night. His sustenance had become a ceaseless vigil. Far more dreadful than his physical collapse was his unraveling mind. His every thought revolved around healing rituals. He would sit for hours clutching reliquaries, whispering to saints he believed hovered at the edge of sight. Courtiers reported hearing him describe in vivid detail visions of celestial feasts, banquets of angels and martyrs, only to scream when they failed to manifest. His world had contracted to one torment, salvation. As his mind deteriorated, so too did his terror. Charles became convinced that not poisoners, but demons lurked within his chambers. Guards were stationed not to protect him from assassins, but from spirits. They watched over jars of ointments through the night, while priests murmured psalms to guard against sorcery. The king awoke repeatedly, demanding that every crucifix be counted, every vial blessed. Panic seized him at the slightest change in arrangement, as though Satan himself moved unseen through his medicine. The atmosphere of court became unbearable. Those who had once competed for the honor of serving at his bedside now fabricated maladies to escape him. The reek of infection, the sight of his trembling hands clutching relics, the endless sobs of prayer created a living tomb around the throne. Marie-Louise, his young first queen, endured in silent despair. She spent endless hours in her private chapel, not begging for his recovery, but for release from his affliction, and from her own captivity. Some claimed she prayed not for a king, but for a corpse. The economic toll of sustaining Charles's sacred agonies was catastrophic. Feeding his endless regimen of tonics and imported relics consumed nearly half the crown's treasury. Whole caravans carried spices, exotic lard and sacramental wines across the Pyrenees for the king's distressed stomach. Parish funds meant for the poor were diverted to purchase sugar, camphor, and bezoar. Meanwhile, famine crept through Castilian villages as livestock vanished, not for feasts, but for potions. Chroniclers could not ignore the irony. While their king swallowed sanctified elixirs in search of life, his subjects starved in faith. By 1699, his body was surrendering to the accumulated toll of a lifetime of degeneration. The few physicians who remained compiled notes that read like catalogues of modern affliction. His heart, enlarged and overstrained, fluttered wildly. His liver, saturated with mercury and wine, had hardened to wax. His breath rattled shallowly, caught between his withered lungs and constricted throat. At times he would slip into delirium mid-prayer, his hand locked around a crucifix, only to wake gasping for holy water. He had become a prisoner within his own skull, unable to stand, scarcely able to speak, yet still issuing commands with feeble authority. Terrified attendants obeyed his final demands, even those that hastened his demise. Monks propped him upright each dawn, washed his seeping sores, and administered draught after draught. Physicians packed his gums with honey and ashes of relics, but nothing could stop the rot that seeped from within. By then, the smell had grown unholy. Witnesses spoke of an odor that clung to walls and drapery, that followed courtiers through corridors like a curse. Even the devout held scented cloths to their faces. His chambers echoed with constant murmurs, not feasting but prayer, groans, invocations. Despite his ruin, Charles's obsession endured. He continued to swallow relics as though each drop could resurrect his bloodline. Every ritual became a final challenge to fate. His mind flickered between rapture and terror. His pulse faltered. His skin turned the color of candle tallow. The embers of the Habsburg line were dying. By November, it became undeniable. The king, this pale spectre of a once mighty dynasty, was nearing his end. His heart shuddered. His breath thinned. Yet even then, he attempted one last swallow. According to witnesses, his final lucid request was not for salvation, but for sanctified water. As though in the end, his faith refused to perish before he did. When Charles II finally passed, it was not with dignity, but with the resignation of a man consumed by the very miracles he sought. The king who could not eat had been devoured, by prophecy, by blood, by the inexorable decay of his name. It took a hushed procession and careful hands to carry him. The coffin was light, yet fragile, and additional braces had to be fitted, so the wood would not splinter under the shifting of the body. During the funeral rites, the air grew thick with incense and a sweeter, sicklier smell that no priest could drown. Some attendants swore they saw the lid flex with the swelling inside. Others turned away pale, whispering that it was a sign. The court murmured that it was judgment, that even in death, the king's body seemed to resist the world that had failed him. Royal physicians conducted a secret autopsy. Their notes, sealed and hidden, describe a body unmade from within. The skull was oddly shaped, the jaw heavy and misaligned. The brain, they wrote, held more water than thought. The heart was undersized and slack, the lungs mottled and weak. The liver showed the scars of countless draughts and physic, its surface pallid and stiff. The intestines were inflamed and darkened, the stomach thin and tremulous, containing only traces of the last medicinals he had swallowed. Syrups, wine-thick cordials and milk curdled with powders. The evidence was unmistakable. This was not a ruin of excess, but of insufficiency, of a body never truly allowed to live, yet forced to endure. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the genitals, withered, atrophic, the unmistakable seal of a bloodline that had reached its end. The physicians disagreed about causes, but agreed about consequence. Heirs were never coming. The autopsy notes were locked away. Portraits remained on the walls, faces smoothed, jaws softened, eyes raised toward heaven. The image had to be preserved, even if it bore no resemblance to what lay beneath the lid. What followed was not merely a succession, but an eclipse. Spain awoke to the fact that the miracle it had prayed for, a healthy heir, had been a mirage all along. Ministers' untied budgets swollen with alchemy and ritual. Apothecaries who had become oracles returned to selling simples. The palace chapels grew quieter. The treasuries, emptier, across the countryside. Famine and taxes had left wounds that no holy water could staunch. The empire he left behind had the same shape as his body, diminished, brittle, exhausted. Painters called again, as they always do when kings die. They avoided the late likeness, the drooping lip, the perplexed eyes, the skin sallow with remedies, and instead painted him as they wished him to have been, composed, upright, crowned by certainty. The monstrous truth of his final form was entombed in stone, and in archives where wax seals kept company with dust. But letters survived. So did the private memoranda of envoys, the confessions of courtiers, the steadier handwriting of physicians who could not help but measure what faith could not cure. Study the papers, and a figure emerges, not a tyrant glutted on flesh, but a man devoured by inheritance, surrounded by candles and cures, watching the cup approach as if salvation could be poured. His terror of demons, his counting of relics, his nightly inventories of vials and crucifixes, these were not quirks, but symptoms. The more closely one examines his decline, the more obvious it becomes that Charles's destruction was not sudden, nor purely physical. It was systemic. The Habsburg myth persisted, even as the Habsburg blood failed. Some called him a martyr of duty, others, a caution written in bone and water. Centuries later, physicians would point to his case as a study in congenital ruin. Historians would point to his reign as a study in the theology of desperation. He stands as proof that power without renewal does not sanctify a nation, it starves it. After his death, a new crown would come, but not from his line. The War of the Spanish Succession would turn Europe into a counting house of claimants and canons. Treaties would carve borders, ledgers would count debts, but the shadow that lingered in Spain was not the memory of victories lost. It was the memory of a king who never truly possessed himself. Charles II was entombed in the Escorial, among kings whose effigies promised continuity, yet there was a cruel symmetry in that silence. He represented not the beginning of a lineage, but its last echo. His body symbolized not corruption by appetite, but attrition by ancestry. Creation and consumption, raised to the level of creed, had met at a single point and gone out. He was not conquered by rebels, nor by plague, nor by foreign blades. He was conquered by the very thing that crowned him blood. His story reminds us that between sanctity and superstition, between ritual and remedy, the distance is perilously thin. Those who saw him in the end struggled to reconcile the childlike corpse with the weight of a kingdom. The golden promises of the dynasty had hardened into a reliquary holding nothing that could grow. His death marked not merely the end of a reign, but the end of the illusion that inheritance alone could sustain greatness. Today his story endures not as a celebration of monarchy, but as a mirror held to lineage, to the perils of worshipping a name after the body has failed. No ritual could save him, no title could renew him. The flesh, no matter how anointed, is mortal. In the end, the throne did not destroy Charles II, nor treason, nor exile. He was undone by the blood that made him king.